Rome glittered with marble palaces, golden statues, and streets filled with whispers of both glory and fear. At the center of it all stood Emperor Nero, a ruler who had inherited an empire, yet seemed consumed by his own desires and demons. He was adored by some for his artistic performances and extravagant games, yet despised by many for his cruelty, paranoia, and unpredictable rage. In the eyes of the Senate and the common people, he was less a protector of Rome and more a threat from within. But behind all the spectacle, Nero was a man tormented by a single memory: the violent death of his beloved wife, Poppaea Sabina. She had been the jewel of his court, admired for her beauty and elegance, but her fate was sealed one night when Nero, in a fit of uncontrolled anger, struck her down. The act shattered not only his household, but also his mind. Rome's emperor became a man haunted by guilt, yet unwilling to accept the consequences of his own brutality. The loss of Poppaea left a void in Nero's world that nothing could fill. He sought solace in luxuries, in music, in games, but none of it silenced the ghost that walked beside him in every shadow of the palace. This grief did not soften him, it twisted him further. The wound became an obsession, and the obsession soon demanded a monstrous solution. What came next would not be the act of a grieving husband, but of an emperor consumed by madness. It was the beginning of a story so bizarre, so horrifying, that even Rome, a city accustomed to blood and cruelty, would whisper of it in disbelief. The turning point of Nero's madness came with the tragic death of his wife, Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was known across Rome for her striking beauty, her ambition, and her influence over the emperor. She had risen to power not just as Nero's consort, but as a woman who commanded the court with elegance and cunning. For a time, she seemed untouchable, the very embodiment of imperial grace. But beneath the golden facade of their union lay volatility. Nero's temper was legendary, sudden, violent, and unpredictable. One night, consumed by jealousy or rage, he lashed out at Poppaea. The blow was fatal. Rome's jewel, the woman who once captivated the empire, was left lifeless at the hands of its ruler. Her death stunned the empire. The people of Rome whispered in shock, though fear silenced many voices. The Senate dared not speak against the emperor, yet in private they condemned the act as the most shameful of Nero's reign. Even Nero himself was struck, not with remorse in the ordinary sense, but with something stranger, an obsession that her absence could never be tolerated. The palace became haunted. Every hall, every shadow, seemed to carry the memory of Poppaea. Nero, who once displayed her proudly to the empire, now wandered like a man possessed, unable to accept the void he had created. Her death marked not only the loss of his wife, but also the collapse of the last fragment of stability in his life. This was not the end of Poppaea's influence. In truth, it was only the beginning, for Nero's grief would soon twist into something darker, a plan to defy death itself. In the aftermath of Poppaea's death, Nero became restless, his grief warping into obsession. No luxury, no performance, no new lover could erase her image from his mind. And then fate placed in his path a boy named Sporus, a young teenager whose delicate features bore an uncanny resemblance to the lost empress. Sporus was slender, fair, and almost fragile in appearance. Whispers spread quickly through the court that Nero looked upon him not as a servant, nor as a youth to be protected, but as a vision, a living echo of Poppaea. The emperor's gaze lingered on the boy in a way that unsettled even his closest advisors. It began innocently enough, with Nero summoning Sporus to his side, gifting him fine clothes, and speaking to him with a tenderness no one expected. But soon it became clear that this was not kindness. It was the beginning of a terrible plan, one that would strip the boy of his identity and force him into the shadow of a dead woman. Rome had seen cruelty before, but this was different. This was not the cruelty of war or politics. It was the cruelty of obsession, a twisted desire to bring the dead back to life at any cost. Nero's fascination with Sporus grew darker with each passing day. What began as admiration soon twisted into possession. The emperor no longer saw the boy as himself, he saw him only as the vessel through which Poppaea could be reborn. He commanded that Sporus be treated as if he were of noble blood. Servants dressed him in silks, adorned him with jewels, and trained him in the gestures and manners once displayed by the empress. The resemblance became haunting. To those who watched, it was as if Poppaea had returned, though behind the painted face stood a frightened boy with no escape. Court whispers grew louder. Some believed Nero had lost his mind completely. Others feared speaking at all, for even a hint of criticism could mean death. In silence, Rome's elite watched as their emperor bent reality itself to satisfy his obsession. For Sporus, the palace became a prison. Every smile, every gesture was dictated by Nero's will. He was no longer a boy, he was a shadow forced to live in the body of another. By now, Nero's obsession had consumed him entirely. He was no longer satisfied with dressing Sporus in silks or teaching him the gestures of a dead empress. What he craved was something far more grotesque, to erase the boy's identity and remake him in Poppaea's image. According to ancient sources, Nero ordered an unthinkable act. Sporus was subjected to castration, a brutal procedure that stripped him not only of his body's natural course, but of his very self. Rome had witnessed cruelty in gladiatorial arenas and in public executions, but this was different. This was cruelty carried out in the name of love, or rather, in the name of obsession disguised as love. Afterward, Nero presented Sporus not as a servant, but as a lady. He was paraded before the court in fine gowns, adorned with jewels, and introduced as though Poppaea herself had returned from the grave. To the onlookers, it was horrifying, yet none dared to speak, for who could question the will of Rome's emperor? For Sporus, the transformation was nothing less than a living death. He had been robbed of his body, his freedom, and even his name. From this moment on, he ceased to be Sporus. In Nero's eyes, he had become Poppaea reborn. The emperor smiled, as if he had conquered death itself. But in truth, he had only created a ghost, a living shadow trapped in the body of a broken boy. Rome had seen countless spectacles, gladiatorial games, triumphal processions, and ceremonies drenched in wealth and blood. But nothing could prepare the city for what Nero commanded next, a wedding unlike any other. In a lavish ceremony, attended by senators, courtiers, and guards, Nero married Sporus. The boy, now forced into the role of Poppaea reborn, was veiled like a bride, dressed in the finest silks, and paraded before the empire as though he were truly the empress returned from the grave. Nero himself played the groom, smiling proudly, as if this grotesque performance could erase the memory of his crime. The court stood in silence. Some trembled with horror, others hid their disgust, but none dared to protest. To object would have meant death. And so Rome's elite bore witness to the emperor's madness, applauding a union that turned grief into humiliation. For Sporus, the ceremony was a nightmare. Every step, every vow, every gesture confirmed the theft of his life. He was no longer seen as a boy, not even as himself, but only as an echo of a woman who could never return. This wedding was not a celebration of love, but a performance of power, proof that Rome's emperor could bend even life and death to his will. The wedding sent shockwaves through Rome. Though no one dared to challenge Nero openly, the people whispered in taverns, in markets, and in the quiet corners of the city. To them, it was not a marriage, but a mockery, a grotesque display of power that turned their emperor into a figure of ridicule. The senators sat in silence, bound by fear. Many despised Nero, but their hatred was caged behind polite applause. To condemn him meant death, and so they chose survival over honor. In private, however, they called the ceremony shameful, a disgrace to the empire that had once prided itself on discipline and dignity. Among the common people, reactions were mixed. Some were horrified, others laughed bitterly, and a few believed it was a sign of divine punishment for Rome's sins. For them, the emperor's madness was no longer hidden. It stood at the heart of the empire, veiled and crowned, mocking both life and death. Yet despite the whispers, no rebellion stirred. Fear kept the city quiet. The people of Rome endured, watching in disbelief as their ruler sank deeper into the shadows of obsession. After the grotesque wedding, Sporus was no longer hidden in the palace's shadows. He was brought into the heart of the imperial court, seated beside Nero in public ceremonies, and displayed to Rome as if he truly were the Empress Reborn. At banquets, he was treated with the honors of a noblewoman. He poured wine for Nero, received gifts from courtiers, and endured the curious stares of foreign ambassadors. To outsiders, the charade was surreal. Rome, the mighty empire, now bowed to the fantasy of its unstable emperor. But behind the silk and jewels, Sporus remained a prisoner. Every smile was forced, every gesture rehearsed. He was surrounded not by family or friends, but by guards and flatterers who ensured his obedience. The palace walls glittered, but they held him tighter than any chain. For Nero, Sporus was proof of his power. He paraded him, not only as a wife, but as a symbol that he could conquer death itself, bending reality to his will. For Sporus, however, each appearance was a reminder that his life was no longer his own. Rome's court became his stage, but the performance was never-ending, and the role was one he had never chosen. As the years passed, Nero's empire began to crumble around him. The provinces rebelled, the treasury emptied, and the Senate turned against their emperor. The man who once saw himself as a godlike artist now found himself hated, mocked, and hunted. But even in his decline, Sporus remained at his side. The boy, now a young man, was still paraded through ceremonies as Nero's wife. To Rome's enemies, it was a sign of weakness, proof that the emperor had lost all sense of dignity. To Nero, however, Sporus was the only fragment of comfort left in a world that was slipping away. The palace that once glittered with feasts and games grew darker and emptier. Nero's allies abandoned him one by one. The whispers of rebellion grew into open defiance, and soon Rome itself called for his death. For Sporus, Nero's downfall brought no freedom. He was bound by the emperor's obsession until the very end, forced to play the role of a ghost while the empire collapsed around them both. In the summer of AD Lo-Shabar, Nero's world finally collapsed. Abandoned by the Senate, deserted by the Praetorian Guard, and hunted by his enemies, the emperor who once ruled the greatest empire on earth was reduced to a fugitive. He fled through the streets of Rome, disguised and terrified, until he found refuge in the villa of a loyal freedman. There, surrounded by only a handful of companions, Nero realized the end had come. The Senate had declared him a public enemy, and his capture meant humiliation, torture, and execution. The man who had demanded applause now feared the jeers of the very people he once ruled. With trembling hands, Nero lifted a dagger to his throat, but could not bring himself to strike. It was his secretary who finally drove the blade, ending the life of Rome's most infamous emperor. The Palace of Illusions collapsed, and with it, the nightmare of Nero's reign. For Sporus, Nero's death was not salvation. He was freed from the emperor, but not from the shadow Nero had cast upon him. Rome still saw him not as himself, but as the ghost of a dead woman, forever trapped in a role he had never chosen. With Nero gone, Sporus might have hoped for freedom. But Rome was not kind to him. Instead of being released from his nightmare, he was passed from one powerful man to another, each using him as a symbol, a curiosity, or a tool for their own ambitions. First, he was taken into the household of Nymphidius Sabinus, a commander of the Praetorian Guard. Nymphidius, too, forced Sporus into the role of wife, flaunting him in public to legitimize his own authority. What should have been a moment of liberation became a continuation of humiliation. Later, when Otho, one of Nero's former allies, briefly seized the throne, Sporus was again drawn into the imperial circle. To the people of Rome, he was no longer Sporus at all. He was a shadow, a ghost that had outlived the emperor who created him, yet could not escape the role imposed upon him. Each day, Sporus carried the weight of a stolen identity. He had been denied the chance to live as himself, trapped forever in the mask of a dead empress. Even after Nero's death, the empire would not let Poppaea's ghost rest. Sporus's life did not end with freedom or redemption. After Nero's fall, he remained a prisoner of memory, a living reminder of the emperor's madness. Even as Rome changed rulers, his fate never changed. He was still paraded, still humiliated, still trapped in the role of a woman who had died long ago. When Vitellius rose to power, the cruelty reached its final peak. It is said that he planned to force Sporus to reenact Poppaea's death in public, a grotesque spectacle meant to entertain the crowds. Faced with such horror, Sporus made his final choice. He ended his own life, refusing to play the emperor's theatre once more. Thus, the boy, who had been turned into a ghost, was gone. But his story did not fade. Historians would remember him as a tragic figure, a victim of power twisted into obsession. Through Sporus, Rome was forced to confront a question it could not answer. What does it mean when an empire allows one man's madness to rewrite another's life?